This was the last minute addition. Oh, was it? Yeah. No problem.
Check.
Good morning. They're here? Okay, good. Good morning, muy buenos dias. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. Special welcome to our distinguished guest, Foreign Minister of Honduras. Very glad to have you here. We will be joined in about 2 minutes by the other two foreign ministers. Steve Inskeep, great to have you here as well. Welcome to the Ambassador of Honduras and to his colleagues who will join us in a moment. Es un gran gusto tener ustedes aquí. Ministra, es un gran honor tenerla aquí con nosotros. Y bienvenidos a todos. Today, the Wilson Center is very pleased, on behalf of Jane Harman, our president, very pleased to host the three foreign ministers of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. They're speaking here today in advance of a meeting they will have tomorrow at the White House between the presidents of the three countries and President Obama. They will be discussing the situation of young people who have been migrating in unprecedented numbers in recent months from Central America across Mexico and into the United States. This situation is, as we all know, a human tragedy, and it's aroused significant and well-deserved concern in all of our countries. Both push and pull factors are involved in this flow of children and young people from Central America. There is, on one hand, the lure of a better life in the United States, and in some cases, in many cases, the opportunity to be reunited with family members who already live here. There's also the desperation of persistent poverty and the fear of personal safety because of high levels of violence in some of these communities that drive young people away and to undertake a several thousand-mile trek northward. To be certain, there are no simple solutions to this problem. In the short term, a number of measures can be taken to dissuade young people from making the dangerous trek north. The governments of the three countries here represented, as well as of Mexico and the United States, have already taken a number of these steps. But the longer-term challenges that have to do with poverty and violence are going to require sustained efforts to invest in education, jobs, the institutions for rule of law in countries of origins. And these are things that primarily have to be done in each country and led by their governments and their societies. But there's also, since this is an issue that really binds us together, there are some opportunities to do things together across the region, from Central America to North America. Our colleagues at the Wilson Center have been covering this issue extensively. Cindy Arnson and Eric Olson, among others, Chris Wilson, and others have been speaking extensively about this. They have been writing, testifying in Congress, convening discussions with key policymakers, civil society leaders, and others. This is a strong commitment of our center, both to Central America, which is a region we focused on a great deal, the U.S.-Mexico border we focused on a great deal as well, and also migration is a major concern for many of us around at the Wilson Center. And a few months ago, we did a report with the Migration Policy Institute, what we called a regional migration study group, where we looked specifically at Central America, the three countries here, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, as well as Mexico and the United States, and what we should be doing together in terms of managing migration and in terms of regional competitiveness, so we could both manage migration flows better, but also begin to deal with some of the long-term concerns. And it was a report that came out that actually was had people from all of the 5 countries involved in putting it together. And I would commend it to you that we did this before the major flow started, before this became a news story in the way it has in all of our countries. But there are some ideas there, thinking in terms of our long-term competitiveness and our long-term security in the 5 countries and what binds us together and why we all benefit by working together, that would be worth looking at. The Wilson Center's president, Jane Harman, is not with us today. She actually is at the Aspen Institute, co-chairing an advisory group to the Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson. She let me know earlier this morning that she spoke with the Secretary last night, and one of the things that he pointed out is that, in fact, the migration flows are decreasing, of young people are decreasing noticeably. The foreign minister has pointed this out as well from the numbers that they have. We're seeing about a 50% drop over the past 15 days. This is extremely heartening. It's a sign that some things to dissuade the flow are working. But obviously what this really should allow us to do is focus on the root causes going forward. And focusing on the root causes is something that is in the interest not only of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, but also the United States and Mexico. And welcome to the foreign ministers of El Salvador and Guatemala. Good to have you here, and good to have their ambassadors here as well. The Wilson Center and its Latin American program are proud to be a trusted space where these issues can be discussed, thoughtfully discussed, and actionable ideas can be generated. And I'm very pleased to turn this over to Dr. Cynthia Arnson, who is the director of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Cindy.
Andrew, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you for your patience. Thanks especially to Ambassador Zamora of El Salvador, Ambassador Mia of Honduras, and the three distinguished ministers, Hugo Martinez of El Salvador, Fernando Carrera of Guatemala, and Mireya Agüero of Honduras. Andrew, as you've noticed, the crisis of unaccompanied minors has given rise to a roiling debate in the United States, not only in the Congress, where there are very divergent opinions over how to respond, but also in the cities and towns across the United States that have been asked to shelter large numbers of children pending the review of their cases. For all the hardships that have been suffered by these young people and all the divisions here about how to respond, I see perhaps one very thin silver lining in this crisis, which is that it has focused renewed attention on the insecurity and lack of opportunity that affect millions of Central American citizens. In fact, I can recall, and there are some veterans of previous eras in U.S. relations with the region, I can recall no time since the Central American Wars of the 1980s when so much U.S. media and policy attention has been paid to the region. We may have differing opinions on what is responsible for the surge in these minors, but there can be little dispute over the objective conditions from which they come. According to our own Department of Homeland Security, and I quote, Salvadoran and Honduran children come from extremely violent regions where they probably perceive that the risk of traveling alone to the U.S. is preferable to remaining at home. Poverty levels in this so-called Northern Triangle of three countries have gone down since the 1990s, but it is still the case that approximately 45% of Salvadorians, 55% of Guatemalans, and 67% of Hondurans are poor. There is no magic bullet to address these problems. They have taken decades, if not centuries, to develop. But progress is possible with the right leadership, sufficient resources, active civic participation, and adherence to the principles of transparency and accountability. A critical ingredient for policies to be successful is political will and leadership from the region itself. Indeed, I believe that a long-term solution depends not only on what the U.S. government is prepared to commit over the long term, but also what responsibility Central American actors in and out of government are willing to assume to transform their own countries. But I'm optimistic. Central Americans came together with the support of the international community to end their fratricidal wars 2 decades ago. A similar effort, I believe, can be made to convert this current crisis into an opportunity for building more inclusive and democratic societies. I would like to thank Associate Director of the Latin American Program, Eric Olson, Assistant Veronica Colon, and indeed half of the interns in this building for all of their assistance in putting the event today together. And I would like to now turn the program over to the distinguished host of Morning Edition from National Public Radio, Steve Inskeep, whose voice dominates the morning routines in the homes and commutes of so many of us. Steve, it is an honor to have you here, as it is an honor for us to host these three distinguished foreign ministers.
Thank you, muchísimas gracias. Good remarks, thank you very much. She said distinguished, I thought she must be referring to someone else, but thank you all the same. Thanks for your remarks, and Andrew's as well. It's an honor to meet you all and to share this platform with you, and to hear a much discussed American news story from the perspectives of other countries that are so clearly affected. I am speaking here with 3 diplomats. I do understand that, but I wish to begin with an undiplomatic question. We have heard the problem described. Whose fault is it? You look down very carefully and take notes. Foreign Minister Agüero, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much. I think this is, can I speak in Spanish?
Por supuesto.
Voy a volver al español. Es mucho
to
más
speak
cómodo,
in
obviamente.
Spanish. It's a lot more comfortable for me.
Yo siento que definitivamente la pregunta, aunque importante.
Now, I think this question, however important it may be, it doesn't get to the point. This isn't a matter of finding guilty parties or finger pointing. It rather is a matter of how for us to assume our shared responsibility, We have been speaking in Central America from the standpoint of challenges, citizens' challenges, and we have this responsibility that we see as a shared one. However, that is differentiated. That is, we have to, in the case of drug trafficking, we have to look at it from the standpoint of the producing countries, on the one hand, transit countries, as well as consuming countries. Now, Hondurans, from that standpoint, our belief is, and I will speak only on behalf of Honduras, that the lack of opportunities, the levels of violence, of social exclusion that we see in Honduras and have seen over the last couple of years are not only the responsibility of Hondurans. This is a problem that is all-encompassing, that ties into the tragedy of our country being a transit country, which has led us to a situation of a war being waged in our territory, of our having been the ones to take the bulk of the hits by way of deaths, and having large international crime organizations installed in our country, and these can be separated in Honduras. But is this only a problem of drug trafficking, or are there other problems? There are other problems, clearly. When I talk about organized transnational crime, I'm talking about certain difficulties which, without a doubt, are tied to the issue of migration. That is, trafficking in people, of minors, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation. But the correlation in the case of Honduras between the routes of drug trafficking and organized crime and those cities from which the large flows of migrants come are one and the same. So that's why I strike this equation from the shared responsible principle, talking about security, to the principle of burden sharing vis-a-vis this phenomenon that we have seen over the last couple of months. And I'm referring to this historic flow of unaccompanied minor immigrants. Quisiera invitar a los otros ministros exteriores a que participen, pueden hablar en el idioma que gusten, y claro que se va a traducir.
Obviamente. But I will just mention, because there's a webcast, if there's a portion that you're able to say in English and a portion that you're able to say in Spanish, I think that will be outstanding and reach the widest possible numbers of people. So the Foreign Minister of Honduras has talked about co-responsibility, that multiple countries are responsible. Let me dig a little deeper, though. Is there another way that you would like to express who's at fault here? Because we do want to diagnose the problem so that we apply the proper solutions. Please.
Yeah. Disculpa no hablar con tu web en inglés al inicio.
I apologize for not speaking in English. I will be speaking in Spanish. Now, if we take a cold, hard look at the numbers, the crisis of children has some very concrete causes that are the result of a given juncture. This isn't something that is only of now. It goes back to 45, 35 years ago, although it's reached a height in the last couple of years. Now you've got the coyotes, on the one hand, who convince the families of the children that if at this point in time, if they were to bring the children to the United States, given, as I say, the current laws of the United States, they would be able to stay. And then you've got the lack of guile, the innocence of the families that believe that promise. Now, it would seem like all of a sudden, massively, there was this migration of children. But it isn't really a mass migration. Annually in Guatemala, 400,000 new babies are born. And so we have 6.5 million under 18 years of age, 25,000 overall, compared to 6.5 under 18 years of age. And so this isn't really Jordan that has 2 million Syrian refugees flooding in.
Muy pequeño porque tiene que ver con el
It's a small percentage because this relates to this specific phenomenon of duping families into thinking that they can bring their children as a business. Now, we're talking about $2,000, $2,500 as the cost that the coyotes charge to bring children in, to cross them across the river, or up to $7,000 or $8,000. This is so profitable that in the last year, that's why I say this is an exponential growth. The number of coyotes offering this service has grown exponentially in many communities. Now, that said, as this is a relatively small number compared to the overall group of children, it hasn't led to the wholesale displacement of communities within our country. But, however, the migration of Central Americans into the U.S., generally speaking, this is something we have to break down in numbers. I don't think that we have a single explanation in this case. The largest migration of Guatemalans into the U.S. has not taken place in the last 45 years, not even over the last 50 years, but rather in 2001, between 2001 and 2008. And it stopped. That is, this surge stopped with the economic crisis in the United States. Before that, 150,000 Guatemalans were coming in every year. Of 1,600,000 immigrants, according to the 2010 U.S. Census. Overall number for immigrants coming to the country every year. Now, that 2010 census, 1.5 million Guatemalans who are here now. 780,000 are U.S. citizens already, have become U.S. citizens. So only 100 and some odd thousand are here who are not yet citizens, 700,000. They have a residency of one type or another, we think, but we know that 780,000 are already citizens. So this has been a long-standing process whereby they came to the country and have remained here. Now, from 2001 to 2008, there was a surge in the number of children. Now, there are a number of factors leading to this. Chief among them is the U.S. economy, which is very dynamic, or was at that time. It was creating jobs, and there was a demand for workers. Now, there was another very important element that was behind this migration. 2 or 3 tropical storms with Hurricane Mitch and 2 other large storms hit our country, and others contributed to some of the communities being hardest hit and giving rise to immigration. Now, there was also coincidentally a drop-off of Mexican immigrants into the U.S., and so that meant that the coyotes had to make up for that loss of business by bringing in Central Americans. All this added to the fact of a wage differential between U.S. and Central America. That is also a pull factor. Now, this can't be attributed to one administration, one given policy, one given law. These are social phenomena that transpired over an entire period of time that are still there. But from 2008 on, immigration growth has been relatively slow.
I want to point out one
compared
thing
to
in
an
English,
earlier
if I may,
stage.
that I think I had not heard before, a theory that I think I had not heard before, and be certain that with my poor Spanish that I understand you. I believe you're telling me that there was less demand by Mexicans to travel to the United States, and that the coyotes had moved south, that the trafficking networks, human trafficking networks, moved south in search of human beings and found your countries. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, and the numbers are supporting that, okay? Both in terms of adults and children. It's very interesting. In 2008, all of the total of children coming to the U.S., minors, you had at least 17,000 from Mexico. By 2011, it was down to 11,000, okay? When you see the trend of Mexicans, you see the trend of Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras going up,
Right.
okay? And when it reaches this low, this 11,000 in 2011, the next year is when you see the surge in Central American children coming, okay? And it's a good business, as I'm always describing. It's a good business. It's very profitable, okay? So there are very specific elements of a market that has been created for illegal, smuggling of people that, explains many of the things. Why do I use this type of explanation? It's the same with drugs, okay? We always discuss it as it was a question of law enforcement. It's a question of markets and how markets work. Okay, and if we understand how the markets work, then we will find solutions for the problems. But if we continue to enhance the idea or follow the idea that this is a law enforcement problem and we can only solve it through law enforcement, we will be stuck as we are stuck with the drug wars currently in our countries.
¿Cómo puede cambiar el mercado para humanos? How do you change the market for human beings?
The first thing, very important, you have to attack the smuggling networks. Okay, this is something we haven't done. Okay, we captured a smuggling network 7 weeks ago in Guatemala. How much noise have you heard about it?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay, it's not important in the news. Okay, how many people were captured in Guatemala? 14 people. That network. How many people in Mexico? About 15. How many people in Texas? 45. Okay, 45. The heads were based in Texas. Okay, so this is something that has to be rewritten, the story of how this smuggling networks work really, and how this business has been developed over years. But definitely, we need to tell the smuggling networks, with children you cannot really get into. I mean, I think there's a limit for everything. Maybe an adult can say, you know, I can give you money, and that is more or less like an illegal contract, but that is an adult. But when it's a child, it is not possible. We should stop the flow of children, because that type of business, that type of networks, really will create many problems for children themselves and for our countries, but for children, definitely.
Okay, tenemos dos razones. We have narcotraficantes, we have human smuggling. Foreign Minister Martinez, would you like to add what you blame?
Bueno, nosotros hemos dicho siempre que este fenómeno
We have always said
migratorio
that this migratory phenomenon has multiple causes. There are some reasons that have already been aired here by my colleagues, but there is another situation, which is there has been a lack of opportunities in these points of origin of migrants, economic opportunities, education opportunities, and in this context, also a lack of security. And so when we were talking with Vice President Biden about this, we said this isn't a matter of finding guilty parties, but of acting in the short term to address a current crisis, but also thinking about the mid and long terms, because the structural factors that lead to this migration are not short-term factors. In the short term, what are we already doing as countries? And we have been working in coordination among those of the Northern Triangle together. For example, attacking the traffickers and persons, guarding our borders more carefully, capturing those engaged in the trafficking of persons. We have a joint campaign in the three countries, an awareness campaign, to make parents aware of the inherent risk in sending their children off along a very hazardous path through the U.S. And oftentimes we're talking, putting them in the hands of people who are the same people involved oftentimes in the drug trafficking networks. Now, that's in the mid and long term, and we can talk about some of the short term, rather. And we can talk about some of the other things we've been doing to staunch this flow of unaccompanied minors. But we have made a proposal to the Obama administration and other international bodies about the measures that need to be taken now in the mid and long term. And these measures are aimed at attacking the structural problems of migration. These are measures that require an investment of resources in the countries of origin of the migrant population to create entrepreneurism, jobs, micro businesses, small and mid-sized businesses, such that people feel motivated to stay home and work where they live. And so a second approach would be to a wager on education and technical and vocational training for young people and adolescents, if we were to offer to young children and teenagers good education, good training, vocational technical training, for them to be able to come into the labor market, that is going to spur them to want to stay in their countries of origin. Now, a third approach would be investment in security. We have been focusing the cities in each one of the countries where there is the biggest problem with violence and gangs, and we are going to have to intervene for prevention and for law enforcement to strike out against crime and to ensure the reinsertion of those who have been victims of gangs. Now, something else is very important. We've been talking about the lack of economic opportunities. But you also said something about needing to invest in security. Is there a lack of government in these countries? ¿Hay falta de gobiernos? No, because the sheer size of transnational organized crime, this is not something that can be tackled in isolation, either by one country or one administration. This is something that we are going to have to tackle jointly. Organized crime does not respect laws, borders, and if we don't come together in a all-out war against this organized crime, there's no other solution. Certainly, the drug trafficking networks and the networks of trafficking in persons have their people who collaborate with them in all of our countries, including the United States. And so the only way for us to tackle this problem is for us to join forces, work together, share information. Those networks that we capture, we have to share that information with the U.S. Those seizures or arrests made in the United States, that information needs to be shared with us. One country in isolation, operating alone, will not be able to eradicate this problem. We have to work together. Tengo la misma pregunta para usted, señora ministra.
One of the things that have not been said, and first I want to point out that probably it seems diverse, the response that you have gotten from the three of us, but in fact you can complement them if you see it in another way.
Yes.
Because when I address the problem of violence, by no means I was telling that this is the only cause for migration.
Yes.
And I have to say that I fully agreed with it has been said by my colleagues in examining the causes for migration. As Fernando said, migration is a historical phenomenon. When you have places where economic development is happening, this come, as an attraction for people to go and look for or think they're going to find a better life, even if it's not true sometimes, but they think they are looking for something better. So when I talked about violence, is because in the case of Honduras, the rising in homicides, for instance, has been so high. And we have data also supporting that 70% of the homicides in Honduras are absolutely related to drug trafficking. So if you have that in mind, and you have a small budget as a country like Honduras has, what do you say when you have to give 20% of your gross national product to the cost of security? I mean, we are...
Is that a correct number? You are currently spending 20%?
20% of our PIB, de nuestro Producto Interno Bruto, en luchar contra la violencia.
Okay.
Entonces, si tenemos que le damos 20%...
So let's say 20% of our GDP is devoted, that is, to the overall cost of violence, and then 1.8% for health care. How then would it be possible when we talk about the lack of opportunities? What we see is if we don't break from this vicious cycle, one thing ultimately impacts on another. So ultimately, I think for any one of our governments, and this migratory crisis
una suerte de radiografía
is
alrededor
like
de ver algunas vulnerabilidades
a snapshot of our country that shows us, puts in stark relief what our vulnerabilities are, but also
de
shows
los países de tránsito o de destino.
the shared responsibility that needs to be taken by the transit and destination
Que
countries.
debemos trabajar para quebrar
So
ese ciclo,
we all have to work
en que
together
la
to
violencia
break this
no
cycle,
sea
because
algo que
violence
no nos incentiva la inversión. Nosotros hemos
doesn't
trabajado como gobierno en
encourage
los últimos
investment.
años
We have been working in our administration over the last couple of years with two large initiatives to create jobs and to attract foreign direct investment. But if the risk factor is so high as a result of the problem of violence, how much as governments can we actually do
de atraer efectivamente
to
inversión y
really
crear nuevos
attract
empleos?
investments
Tenemos
and thereby
primero,
create
obviamente,
jobs?
que enfocarnos al
The
tema
first
de
thing
prevención
is
de la
to
violencia,
focus on
a crear,
containing
obviamente, un
violence,
ambiente mucho
to
más
create a
seguro, de
much
seguridad no
safer
solamente
environment. And when I
ciudadana,
talk about
sino
security, not
también
just citizen
seguridad
security,
jurídica,
but legal
de
certainty,
confianza en las instituciones
so
del
that
Estado,
there is
que
trust in
también
state
son
institutions,
atacadas
which are
por el crimen
also
organizado.
undermined
Entonces hay
by
que ver
organized
todo
crime.
de
So
manera
all
integral.
this has to be done in a comprehensive
Precisamente por
way.
eso es que uno de los ejes
That's why
transversales en
one of
Honduras,
the
precisamente de
cross-cutting
este gobierno,
approaches of this
es
current
el
administration in
tema,
Honduras
de la lucha contra la
is
corrupción,
the fight against
porque
corruption,
efectivamente
because
el crimen organizado
organized crime
efectivamente ha tenido un impacto alrededor de
has
la credibilidad
had
misma de
has
las
undermined
instituciones
the credibility of democratic
democráticas. Y eso es algo
institutions,
que nosotros
without a doubt. And this is
aceptamos,
something that we
aceptamos y trabajamos en eso.
accept. We accept that fact, and that's why we're working on this. So yesterday, there were some
no gubernamentales
non-government
de Honduras
organizations from
que
Honduras here
afortunadamente han
who
aceptado
have,
acompañar al gobierno de
fortunately,
Honduras
decided
como
to come on board to join
veedores
the government of
desde la
Honduras
sociedad civil
from
en
the
los
standpoint of civil
procesos, por
society
ejemplo,
to
de
engage in
licitación
these
o compras de medicamentos en el área de la
processes, let's say,
salud,
for
o acompañar
purchasing medicines in
Honduras
healthcare,
en lo que está
or
haciendo con Transparencia Internacional
and helping
para
Honduras with what
tener,
it's doing with Transparency
una
International
capacidad de gestión
for
mucho
us
más
to ensure a
abierta
more open
transparente.
and
Entonces,
transparent
lo que quiero
administration
decir
or
es que cuando
government.
hablamos de
So when
violencia,
we
cuando
talk
hablamos
about
del
violence
comportamiento de los mercados,
and when
como
we
decía
talk
Roberto,
about market
cuando hablamos,
behavior,
como decía Hugo, de la
as
falta de
Hugo was saying, when we
oportunidades
talk about the
y
lack
el
of
trabajo que cada
opportunities
uno de nuestros
and
gobiernos
the
debe hacer,
work that
son
needs to be
elementos que no
undertaken by each
podemos
one of our
ver
governments.
desvinculados.
These are things that we cannot
Efectivamente,
see
todo es
in
parte
isolation of each
del
other.
proceso.
All of these
Como
elements
decía
are
Hugo
part of an
también,
overall
la
approach.
causa no es una.
There
El
is no
culpable
single
no es uno.
cause. There is
Aquí
no
tenemos que ver
single
todo en
responsible
una
party.
visión
We
integral
have to have a
y un
comprehensive,
enfoque pragmático, no
all-encompassing,
solamente
and
para
pragmatic
efectivamente
approach,
ver
not
lo que es
only for us
inmediato,
to
que es
take
la
care of
crisis
the
y
immediate
esta
crisis at
emergencia
hand and this
humanitaria de
humanitarian
niños y
emergency
adolescentes no
of
acompañados,
unaccompanied
pero también
children and
ver la
adolescents, but
posibilidad de una
also
visión a más largo
have a longer-term outlook. What is the U.S.
Sí,
responsibility here specifically?
Bueno, podemos hablar mucho tiempo alrededor
Well,
de
we could
eso.
spend a long time talking about that.
Pero para mí hay dos
But
cosas que ya se
I
han
think there are two
mencionado,
things
pero
that have
que
already been
voy a
mentioned here,
parafrasearlas de
and
otra
I
manera.
will paraphrase them
Uno, efectivamente,
in my own
el
words.
hecho de que Estados Unidos, al menos de manera
The fact that the
tradicional,
U.S.
considere
traditionally
el tema del tráfico de drogas o
views
del
the
consumo
issue
de drogas
of drug
en
trafficking
Estados
and the
Unidos
consumption of drugs
como
in
una
the
cuestión
U.S.
de seguridad
as a
pública,
matter of public
desde
security.
Centroamérica esto es totalmente inaceptable.
That's totally
Tiene que haber
unacceptable from the
otra
standpoint of
visión
Central America. There
alrededor
has
del
to be
tema.
a different way
Cuando
of looking at this
Fernando hablaba
issue. When
de las
Fernando was talking
cantidades
about
de personas vinculadas
how
en
many
la
people there
ruta
are
ilegal de personas y hablaba de los porcentajes que
who
hay
are engaged in
de estos
the
negociantes
trafficking
en
of
territorio
adults into the
estadounidense.
U.S. and
Yo recuerdo uno de, no sé si fue uno
how
de
many of
mis
them operate
primeros
within the
faux pas
U.S. I don't know if this was
diplomáticos,
one of the
pero
first
recuerdo que el
diplomatic
segundo
faux
día,
pas committed, but I remember the
como
second day
viceministra
as
de
Vice
Relaciones
Minister of
Exteriores del
Foreign
gobierno anterior,
Relations of the earlier administration. We had a meeting in Panama about the issue of security, and I started to receive a lot of information about how the Sinaloa cartel or the Gulf cartel were setting up shop in Honduras.
de una manera cándida pero deliberada, tengo que confesarlo, pregunté
And I had to ask how are drugs distributed when they come into the U.S. Because we're always talking about the Central American drug cartels operating in Central America, but we never talk about how drugs are distributed once they arrive in the U.S. Because that is the huge drug-consuming country. So what we believed traditionally was the blessing of Central America, which was the fact that it was the bridge between the North and the South. The heart of the hemisphere has become our biggest tragedy, but as a result, precisely of a demand that is eager to receive a good that's produced in the South and that is transported through our territory. Now, 80% of drugs that come into the United States come through Honduras. So are there problems with ties, or there are problems with ties with the United States, but what about the assistance that the United States could provide? ¿Ustedes reciben ayuda, asistencia de Estados Unidos?
Sí.
Do you need more? Yes.
Francamente, sí.
Yes,
Nosotros
honestly, we do.
preveíamos este
We
problema y en 2011
saw this problem coming in 2011, and we made a call to the international community. We called for there to be a Central American strategy that will contain 4 components: prevention, crime, strengthening the institutions for combating crime and law enforcement approach. These are different approaches, and a time frame of funds that need of $300 million that needed to be invested at that point of time. 3 billion, rather, 3 billion. Now, there were amounts pledged, but the execution of these projects currently are very lower than the needs. And we're not saying that this is something that has to be financed only by the international community, only by the U.S. What we're saying is that there is shared responsibility here. Our countries are kicking in our resources, even with all the budgetary difficulties we have, shortcomings we have, but to combat a enemy of such magnitude, transnational organized crime, drug trafficking, much more resources are necessary. And also, this structural phenomenon needs to be attacked. That is, the lack of opportunities in many of our communities throughout their countries has to be tackled also. We have to deal with youth who are being extorted and by organized crime. They're being told that if you don't collaborate with us, we'll kill you. And if you do collaborate with us, you're going to have easy money to buy whatever you want for yourselves. And on the other hand, these children oftentimes are excluded. They don't have sufficient educational opportunities nor labor opportunities. So what we have suggested to the U.S. and the international community is an alliance, a partnership for the prosperity of these countries, which ultimately leads into the prosperity of the United States, because we are too interconnected, too close to each other, and therefore there has to be a common front, a common strategy that will help us solve this problem that ultimately, without a doubt, will have positive repercussions in the United States in the area of stability.
Getting back to my numbers.
Vuelvo a las cifras entonces que había indicado
The
anteriormente.
narratives are very ideological. And they are not based on facts. They are based on perceptions.
We don't know
and,
anything
you
in
know,
Washington about ideological.
Yeah, I know. You're very much based on scientific evidence for taking decisions. Very well known for that, by the way.
Thank you.
Very well done.
Very proud.
Yeah, okay. So, it's not just in Washington, it's everywhere. So anyway, but the thing is, questions of governance, okay? Poor governance should be reflected on certain data that is obvious, okay? For example, mortality rates should be going up. Murder rates should be going up. School coverage should be going down or stagnated, okay? Health sector reform shouldn't be implemented. No reform for the judicial or for the institutions of security taking place. Everything is happening in Central America. Everything. Okay? You see the trends: mortality, child mortality, maternal mortality, going down over the last 20 years. School coverage, primary school coverage, going up over the last 20 years. Murder rates going down during the last 5 years, okay, in all the countries here, okay. So it's not numbers are not supporting the idea that poor governance is taking place, okay. Some good governance is taking place. And the major donors of our countries are our countries themselves, okay. Because many times this is also another ideology. Okay, you need, so you can solve your problems. No, we're solving our problems, okay? I have an $8 billion a year budget from the government of Guatemala that provides me for almost everything that I need to do. What is the international community providing complementary to that? Maybe 200, 300 million, okay? So it's just a marginal part of it, okay? If we continue...
If we looked at all forms of aid from the United States, it would be less than $200 million.
Oh, by all means,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
To Guatemala, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But then the question is, if we continue this way, when are we going to achieve a goal that I consider very important for somehow affecting negatively migration from the Central America to the US, which is secondary school coverage. It's critical, okay? We have secondary school coverage in Guatemala of more or less 27% of our young people, okay?
27%.
27%, that's secondary school coverage. Primary school coverage is almost universal. But secondary school coverage, 27%. Well, if we continue with our resources, I think we will have secondary school coverage universal in the next 15 years, more or less, okay? If you provide us funding, we can cut that to half of it, okay? Because it's a question of funding now, really. Political decision is there. Institutional capacity, you can build it, okay? Problem is, money's now, okay? Second part that I think is important is, there has been said, the question about tax paying in Central America. I think it has to go up, particularly in countries like Guatemala. I cannot speak for the rest, but definitely in Guatemala, tax paying has to go up, okay? We, this government in Guatemala, President Otto Perez, pushed for a fiscal reform at the beginning of the term. Because of constitutional norms and other elements, this has been diluted in a way. But it went the right way, which is taxing personal income. Okay? How much taxation provides personal income in El Salvador? Okay, personal income tax, more or less 2% of GDP. That's what is, which is nothing compared to the U.S. Okay, or to other countries, but still 2%. The average of Latin America is 4%. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
In Guatemala, we collect 0.7% in personal income tax. Okay, so just to give you an example. So a combination
You
between...
said you're meeting John Boehner later, right? Because he may... Bring that
We
up.
are a
Bring that up.
paradise for anyone in the U.S. who's pushing for less taxation. Although I believe our levels of taxation are so low that even extremely conservative Americans will never support that. Okay, I pushed. One day I took a Tea Party manifesto on taxation, and I was going to publish it in Guatemala, just to see the reaction. I was pretty sure everybody would call me a communist. Okay? The Tea Party manifesto on taxation. Okay? In Guatemala would be plain communism. Okay? So definitely we need to improve taxation. Why I'm saying this? Because financing development in the long term will depend on these two elements. Larger contributions, definitely, and improving taxation at the same time. And there has to be a deal in this regard.
I have many more questions, but I'm going to restrain myself because I see from the clock that our time is running down and we want to stay approximately on schedule. Right. I would like to invite a few questions from the audience. I would ask if I call on you to just stand and state your name so we get to know each other a little bit. And because time is short, if you can simply ask a direct question of our guests and we will answer get answers as we can. Right here, ma'am, here in the front. Or not in the front, in the third row.
Hi, Penny Starr with CNS News. I wonder if you could address more about border security in your countries, because especially, they have to breach the border of your countries to go through Mexico to get to our border. So I wonder if you could address that for me. Thank you.
You're asking, are they trying to keep people in?
Yes, I'm asking about their border security.
All right. Anyone want to take that question? Please, go ahead.
Bueno, es lo que ya decíamos. Nosotros hemos observado
We've seen that the flow of unaccompanied minors doesn't really correspond to the registers that we have, the records that we have in the official border points. Evidently, there is a route that it's not always the same route that the traffickers follow, and it is the route that these unaccompanied minors follow. So many of these minors, when they leave our country, they leave our country irregularly. In the case of El Salvador, our laws determine that a minor cannot leave the country without a notarized permit by both parents, if the parents are not accompanying the minor. So what we're doing at this time is increasing patrols throughout our borders. These individuals, these children, are not leaving through the regular points of exit, but they are leaving irregularly. So we have reinforced, we have strengthened our border to guarantee that we don't have that irregular flow of minors out of our country. As parents, we are parents as well, we understand the feeling that a father or a mother has in order to meet their children. But we would like to say to them that it is not worth it. It's not worth risking the lives of your children in this very risky journey.
I think it's very important again on the question of what we are doing and not what should we do. Okay, we identified this from the beginning of this government as a problem. Okay, so we have been working with Mexico on three things. One is the agreement we signed a few weeks ago, in which all Guatemalans willing to stay at least 3 days in Mexico, they can stay in Mexico with no visa, within a territory that is more or less 80 kilometers within Mexico in Chiapas and Tabasco, and the whole territory of Quintana Roo and Campeche. Okay, that is if you want to go for tourism or business, you can do that. You will be surprised how many Guatemalans do make supermarket in Mexico. Okay, the largest Walmart in Mexico is in Chiapas, and 50% of the consumers come from Guatemala. Okay, so that is one thing. But after those 80 kilometers, controls get strict. Okay, you cannot go with that card, nice card. The idea of giving this card is that everybody is identified. Okay, whoever doesn't have a card cannot even get into the 80 kilometers. If it is a person Guatemalan, you say, yes, I'm a Guatemalan, I have my card here. Okay, and then will be stamped when you got into Mexico. But after 80 kilometers, more strict, until it reaches the Tehuantepec Isthmus, where you're going to have, from Chiapas until there, 3 different levels of control. And you may say, well, they can go around the controls, so easy, like they go in the river. Okay, you can do it in the river because you want to go one by one if you want to, okay? That will improve your chances of getting illegally into the U.S. But that's only in the river, because if you want to get to the U.S., you want to go in a convoy, okay? That is cheaper for everybody. So if you go in a convoy, you have to take the Beast or you take a coach, a bus to go there, okay? So it's always roads and railroads. That's what you need to control. That's where 95% of people will go through. Same thing on the side of Guatemala. We're starting to create, we have a project of $350 million of 10 legal crosses from Guatemala to Mexico with the same level of security on both sides, okay? And guess what's the model? The model is the security border you have in McAllen and Reynosa, okay? And so the Corps of Engineers of Mexico designed this pass, this crossing, and we're going to have the same thing. It's quite expensive. I mean, each crossing cost us $35 million, which is a lot of money for us, but it's going to be worth it. And we think in 5 years' time, we're going to have that already in place.
Yo tengo, si me permites, Steve, un comentario muy rápido alrededor
Very
de
quick
esto.
comment in connection with that.
Número uno, un comentario
Number one,
rápido
I have a
alrededor
very quick comment in connection with what Honduras particularly is doing. And in the past 2 weeks, the president decided to work with the Direction of Migration in Honduras. There were 16 blind spots that we call them. Blind spots are crossings, they're not border crossings, they're defined. We call them blind spots. And activities were being conducted there. Trafficking activities, illegal trafficking activities of minors were taking place there. And this has had an effect on us, and many of these coyote groups have been included and taken to justice. So something needs to be noted here, and this is to do with something said before. I think it's always a good idea to make a difference between regular migration from irregular migration. Regular migration is a reality of our globalized world, and no one can deny that. If we weren't to look at this from this viewpoint, there would be a contradiction. All of the countries, the Northern Triangle countries, we have all been pioneers, and we have worked towards having our goods and services and products move quickly from one border to the next. The same thing happens regionally. One could say that there is a contradiction because on the one hand, one can say in this globalized economic world we have facilitating the movement of goods and services, but we have to stop the movement of people. So how can we try and solve this contradiction? Well, we have to look at migration alternatives, legal migration alternatives, regulated migration alternatives. The experience that has come out of this migration emergency shows, once again, that the harder migration measures are, for example, here in the U.S., the more sophisticated illegal trafficking networks are going to become. The hardest it is to meet an objective, then the more expensive the trip is going to be, the greater the risks are going to be, and everything else is going to become correlated or interrelated. So there are certain contradictions and there are certain illogical issues that come out of these processes and that we need to address. When we talk about resources, we talked about the assistance from the U.S. and whether that assistance is sufficient or not sufficient. I wanted to say a couple of things about that. On the one hand, Honduras, because of a Senate decision, has frozen 35% of the funds for the Central American Security Initiative because we haven't certified that the efforts made by the government are sufficient in certain areas. So the question that we pose is, are the funds ready or are they not ready? The funds are there, but they don't get to us. I'm not very good with numbers like my colleague right here from Guatemala, but my view as a woman perhaps is more humanitarian in nature. Apart from the figures and apart from the way in which we have to use figures to base our opinions, well, we have to say that here we're talking about people, we're talking about victims, we're talking about children, we're talking about families that are being broken. And I think this is important. And I think we need to be logical when it comes to these processes, and we need to then think about these things. What have we gotten out of this? What have we gotten out of this strengthening and hardening of the border issues here in the States? Well, if the United States had decided to give 10% of what it has given to, instead of hardening the migration measures, instead of doing that, it would have supported employment programs or maquilas or companies in Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras, the history today would be different. Muy bien, vamos a pasar a un par de preguntas.
Go ahead. Yes.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Jackie Reyes y soy salvadoreña.
I am from
Que vivo aquí en
Salvador,
el
and I live here in the District of Columbia. My question is for our Vice Minister. He's a minister, he's not a vice minister. I'm sorry. The minister, my question is for the minister. Many things have been heard, and there can be campaigns for children not to come here. As a mother, however, If my child is not safe in my country, I'm going to run risks. Many campaigns can be established for individuals not to leave the countries, but if we don't have a good campaign, then it's not going to work. We have a cancer here, which is the different gangs. I went to El Salvador. You can close all the borders you want, but we will always find some way to come to the States. What are the plans that you have to combat violence in our neighborhoods over there in El Salvador? Thank you very much for your question. I talked about some of the measures already. We have focused on 70 out of the 262 municipalities where we have seen the largest number of gangs and the greatest violence acts. And we have started with these municipalities. As you know, we've started just 2 months ago. Salvador Sanchez took office about 2 months ago, and we have identified 70 municipalities. We are going to intervene in these municipalities directly. We not only are going to apply measures to fight gang members and drug traffickers, but also we're going to implement measures to provide security and safety and opportunities to young people. We are acutely aware of the problem that you have put forth. And we know the causes why some individuals are coming to the United States. I would like my statement to be understood that we are looking at this from a unilateral viewpoint. When we're saying that we are strengthening borders, this not only has to do with trafficking of persons, it has to do with drug trafficking, it has to do with how these criminal networks use these paths to move. So we're also looking at measures to invest in education so that these young people can have opportunities. We are going to invest in development projects so that they can have opportunities in their communities of origin. If we go to the northern part of Salvador, in Chalatenango, there was the Technological Institute of Megatenango was built there. These young people have something else to look forward to. They were no longer saying my first option is to leave to the States. No, they're saying I have a technical degree that I'm going to get in agribusiness, in tourism, and this is going to allow me to work in the northern area of Chalatenango. That is why we have implemented measures in the western area and the coastal area of the country with a fund called Millennium 2 that is going to allow us to provide opportunities to these young people. So I agree with you. We have to intervene in those areas where we have the greatest number of violent acts. Una persona aquí de blanco.
You.
Thank you.
Please stand up so we can interfere with the television camera behind you and really irritate that guy. Okay, don't stand up.
I'm going to make my question in Spanish. Mi nombre es Silvia Ayuso del periódico
My
El
name
País.
is Silvia Ayuso from El País. Tomorrow, you are holding a meeting, rather, your presidents are holding a meeting with Mr. Obama. This is not the only meeting that we have had this week. What do you expect out of this presidential meeting? Do you have specific questions that you would like to pose, specifically looking at what is happening to the U.S. Congress, where the Congress is freezing all the funds that are being asked by the U.S. president? What are the possibilities of success that this meeting is going to have? Look, I think that like you said, this meeting is part of a sequence. It started with the visit of President Biden to Guatemala. The three countries were present. Mexico was also present there at the meeting. Then we had a meeting with Secretary Kerry in Panama. Then Guatemala received Secretary Johnson and the Secretary of Governance Osolo from Mexico. So I think this is important because we have seen these events and that have come one after the other, and there are very common ideas that come through. The first, which is very important, is to stop the immediate flow of children. Of course, the most important point here is that if we stop the flow of children, it's a humanitarian measure to protect these children. And this is very important to understand. Many people think that if you stop the flow of children, you're only trying to stop migration. No, that is not the case. illegal groups here are handling groups of children in this arena, and we cannot let that happen. We have to protect the children. So we need to stop this, and this is an essential matter, and it needs to be put very clearly. We're going to work together with the United States to stop this. So we have to take immediate action. Many of these actions have to do with law enforcement, but it also has to do with medium and long-term actions to provide youth in Latin America with opportunities and hope. The other issue that is important, I think, is this idea to establish patterns that are going to allow us to deal with migration issues in the medium term and in the long term. And this is going to be put in the agenda with at the meeting with President Biden and the other meetings. Today we have had meetings as well. Today we've got a meeting with a group of Democratic legislators, and then we're going to have a group with Republican legislators. And these issues are going to be discussed with the administration, with the executive branch of government, but also with Congress. Congress and the executive branch are going to make the political decisions that they are going to make in order to respond to the situation. But our position is a position of cooperation and of opening in order to try and find a solution to this problem.
Perhaps some of you will be able to linger and answer a question, but let me ask each of you, is there a final thought with which you would like to leave this gathering and the people watching on the webcast?
Para mí esta oportunidad
In my opinion, Steve, the first thing that we need to remember is that this is a humanitarian story. There is a political background. There's a deadlock between the different chambers of Congress. There's a bipartisan debate here in the United States. There are structural issues also in our own countries. We can talk a lot about causes, about effects. We can talk a lot about specific situations in time and long-term solutions. But the important thing here is that amidst all this, we have to think that apart from the material elements that we have to solve the issue, there is also a background that needs to exist and that it needs to provide moral options. I don't think I'm going to start an ideological debate here, but we need to look at what we need to do from a correctly humane viewpoint or humanitarian viewpoint, specifically when it comes to migrant minors. In this case, we're looking for the best interest of the child and do the right thing. Se trata de una crisis humanitaria, tenemos que hacer lo correcto. Básicamente una crisis humanitaria. It is a humanitarian story. Me gusta mucho que haya terminado con esas palabras.
Do you
Muchas
want to wait?
gracias
Do you
a
want to
todos
add
ustedes.
something before we
¿Quiere
go? Yes.
agregar?
Okay, go ahead. I'm being told by the people who run this. No, go ahead. Finish, please.
Okay. Yo quiero cerrar.
I just wanted
Diciendo
to end by saying something that is very important. And it has to do with the narrative of the debate that we have here in Washington. The three governments in Central America, we are good partners, and we can work together. And that is very important, because one cannot solve these problems if the governments don't have the capability to meet their commitments. I think that the United States now has an advantage. The three Central American governments are meeting their promises, have a very realistic set of objectives. They don't have problems in facing institutional difficulties. They know that they have them. We have political problems. The U.S. has political problems. The world has political problems. But if we look at these things, we have these problems as well. But I think the northern part of Central America has acquired a certain maturity to face these challenges with responsibility, and that's important to solve these problems. I focused about what we're doing, and the first thing that we asked the United States is for these children to have their rights respected, and for them to be the subject of due process, and for them to have the possibility of going to the judicial instances that need to be applied according to the U.S. legislation. I talked about the efforts that we're making back in our countries, but we want the U.S. to give us that kind of support. The second thing that we ask is cooperation so that we can delve into the medium-term and long-term measures that can solve migration processes, the root causes of migration. Security is important, but also economic opportunities are important for people back in their home countries. If these individuals had had the economic opportunities back in the day, many of them would have never come to the U.S. We always say that we want migration to be an option and not an obligation. We want people not to be obligated to come here and migrate. If we have people that have the basic conditions met and then they want to emigrate, that's fine. They have opted to emigrate. So these two items are very important, and we want the help of the United States in that area. Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking the three foreign
Queremos
ministers
agradecer a
for
los
taking the
tres
time to take our
ministros por
questions today. Thanks again. Thank you. I was told to keep it short.